Let's jump right into capital. So up here we have this image of economic process as the kind of not just a process, but kind of cyclical, not in the sense that modern economics says cyclical, because I think what they mean by cyclical is it's a kind of supposition that they see a phenomenon and then they make a law out of it, which may in fact not be a law. They may have seen the phenomenon once or twice, and then they say it's permanent and part of the structure. So once you've identified the trade cycle, and you have dips and, then you say there is a trade cycle, and then you try and position yourself on the trade cycle, and hey, presto, you have created a trade cycle. It may not have been there in the first place. This is part of the problem of modern economics. You have to be very careful what you think, because the secret of economics, or the mystery of modern economics, is it's very able to create a world which wasn't not there and is not there except in your mind, and then you can make it happen. And so one has to be very careful what one thinks, because that will be tomorrow's reality. And that's all part of this Fred Flintstone story. When you think you shut the cat out and the cat gets in and shuts the door on you, now you have a problem, because now you start to invent all sorts of relationships to the world, and they may be unreal, but you kind of make the world unreal in order to suit your private problem. It's putting it in a kind of strange way, but I think that's not what the people who made the Flintstones had in mind. At least I don't think so, but maybe, who knows? Maybe it's a Neolithic problem and not a modern one after all. But in Steiner's mind, when he talks about the economic process, or he makes a kind of circle of it, he's not directly talking about the trade cycle, the business cycle, or all these things that came up in the 19th century as people tried to scientificize the field of economics. And I think it's important at that point in time that the so-called natural scientific worldview was finding itself thin or deficient or unable to sustain itself, because it kind of, with Bacon, it kind of blocked out anything spiritual, you might say, but now wasn't really able to, he couldn't ignore this, but he couldn't include it because of the assumptions it had made. And you also get this in Adam Smith in his original Wealth of Nations. He talks about the market and so on as the only reality, except there's this thing today we might call it civil society. There's some dimension which he called, I think he sort of said, well, that's dealt with by the state, but he couldn't include it. But his market is not complete, at least not in my understanding. And if you go forward, it goes back to the Grey time. If he could have distinguished between what is, what Steiner would call rights life and what is economic life, he could have said the part I'm describing has to do with economic life and the commodity part of economic life, which isn't the entirety. And there's an area called rights life, which I'm not commenting on. He didn't say that, but he could have said that, or you could go back and make him say that. And then you'd be in this world which is totally, from that point of view, understandable. Then there's a kind of governance that belongs to economic life, which is different, but not worse than the governance that belongs to Parliament. But it's, that's totally rational and understandable, because, governance isn't a one size fits all. It depends what you're governing, how the governance takes place. And you could say, by the same token, Steiner makes a big deal about a free spiritual life, and the governance of a free spiritual life will not be parliamentary. But, if you live in England, we know that because we have things like the Royal College of Nursing, or the Institute of London Foundation of Banking and Finance, which is an institute which exists by a royal charter. So we have all these strange things. They're not the state. They didn't originate in the state. They're not necessarily subject to the state. They're there by a royal charter. And, and that means they can create their own governance depending on their case. And in many professions, like the Royal College of Nursing, or the architects, or gynecology, or there's all sorts of royal colleges, and any profession is organized that in the Royal College, which means it answers to the constitutional monarch, so to speak, not to the state. in a Napoleonic sense, absolutely not. And when you answer to the constitutional monarchy, in the English constitutional monarchy, you're answering to your higher self in reality. You're not answering to King Charles, and he wouldn't think you were. It's a kind of device from the grey time, which when the state was supposed to separate or become differentiated from the economy, also at that time you had the constitutional monarchy. Otherwise, this couldn't happen. And the effect of the constitutional monarchy, whether it's intended or not, whether people believe it or not, is nothing to do with a royal family. It has to do with, in such a constitutional monarchy, when the king or the queen says we, she's just speaking on behalf of everyone's higher being. And it's just an appeal to the subjects to go to that place. It's not an appeal. The king can't do anything. And so you have anomalies like the king cannot comment on his first minister's policy. These are anomalous if you don't have some higher sense of the human being in mind. They just look ridiculous or archaic or, you know, whatever. But I think they're not, and I'm pretty sure King Charles is aware of this and conscious of it within the parameters of what he can share with the public. But if you go, that's all in that grey time when already you could see what Steiner called the three spheres of society were nascent already at that time in the grey time in the 17th, 18th century. It never came to fruition for all sorts of reasons, but it's sitting there as that's the only way we can unscramble today's omelette. So if we kind of have that in mind, you can then see that already with Bacon, the minute he spoke, so to speak, or the minute Newton, the popular minute, spoke, he doubted what he'd said. You know, but that, you know, when Adam Smith wanted to republish The Wealth of Nations at the end of his life and be more cogent about the bit that Marcus didn't cover, his publisher said, no way are we republishing Wealth of Nations. He didn't want, you know, he wasn't going to let the world know that Adam Smith had second thoughts, because what would that do to his market, so to speak? So it's very careful, especially in the English-speaking world, where a lot of these things have happened, Bacon, Newton, so on, to notice this moment when you shut the old gods off and you're so proud of yourself, but that moment the doubt sets in immediately. But now you're too famous. Having shut the gods off, you can't say, oh, by the way, I'd like to let them back in again, because where would you get to? So I think this is very important. Even in someone like Darwin, you may not, one may not get his version of events, but his version of events, the origin of the species, is trying to get the God out of the story. You know, so whether it succeeds or not, it's not the point. You come to this 19th century point in England in particular, where all this is going on. And it's very important to bear in mind every such person, even a Darwin, in order to become a botanist or whatever these people became, first they had to take holy orders. You couldn't get into Cambridge or Oxford unless you took holy orders. This is very important. Even now, they don't call their terms spring, summer, and whatever. It's Michaelmas, and I don't know, and they use all these ecclesiastical terms to name their terms. So it's very important to bear in mind that a scientist like Darwin had first to take holy orders. Otherwise, he couldn't become a scientist. And so it's all this time, and it's in this time, in the mid-19th century, when people started to come up with, they started to touch on the non-material world by life force or the vitality, or they mention all these things, but they couldn't name them. And even Jevons, the economist, when he started looking at sunspots, he's aware there's a dimension to economic life which is shut out by rational thinking, but it's there. So he starts to try and relate sunspots to, you know, to life on Earth. You get all this going on, and it's in such a context that people start finding the trade cycle, because they're looking for, you know, they won't put in these terms, they're looking for a divine wisdom, a given, which they've shut the door on. But now they realize without it, they're a bit stuck. So they can't necessarily invent things. And Steiner's point would be there, if he was to say it, I'm speaking for him, that is no use. You have to go the scientific path. You have to go into science and into the reductionist bit, and then come out the other end of that tunnel into the light again, so to speak, if I use a tunnel image. And you mustn't be afraid of it. You mustn't doubt it. You mustn't put your car in reverse and try and back out of the tunnel. You have no choice. You have to go through until, in its own terms, reductionism says this is not enough, and has an ear for what, it becomes a true materialist economics and not a naughty materialist economics. And I'm saying this because in Steiner's image, you might come to something like a trade cycle. It's not something he arrives at. It's not a concept he uses. He says around this process, which is the circle, so to speak, in his drawing, we go around one way in our first move, and he takes us through land, labor, and capital. And then the whole process reverses and goes the other way back through labor and land. We'll come to this in detail, but what's very important is he says, when you go through this process, when you take hold of the earth and you it's another way of saying, if I go back to this drawing, blue here, blue there, I think would be blue here. So I'm answering my own question. Blue, I'm guessing, is land. Yellow on this drawing and there is labor. And I might change that later. And so he's going from here through the blue, through the yellow, and then he gets to the white bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then he doesn't go on. He turns around and goes back through this whole process again and turns inside out. So that, again, is an epistemological drawing. When you come into a single world economy, the whole epistemology changes and it turns in on itself because it has nowhere else to go. You can't continue going around the circle until Elon Musk populates Mars with his children, whatever his plan is, right? Even then, I think it's a moot point, but that's a new trading. It's just an extension. It's just a colony, really. So I think this is important. And he does all this without reference to trade cycles. He doesn't need the concept of cycles or cyclical behavior, all this kind of stuff. And so it's not so easy to get the handle on Steiner because he's not endorsing cyclical thinking in economics. He's kind of saying, if you went back to the point when you started thinking cyclically and you did what I did, you wouldn't think cyclically. You wouldn't impose a process on life which isn't there. You can impose it, but you're going to have to restructure the whole world of nature, which is kind of what Monsanto and all these things are doing. We can reconstruct the physical world to match our policy prescriptions. Don't think we can't. We certainly can. And it's more a question whether we want to do that or not. And I think we're way far down the road already of rearranging the world to fit our policy prescription, anything but rethink our assumptions, basically. Sounds a bit weird, but it's like that. And it's a choice we have to make. But now, in that kind of image, he's not saying there's nothing cyclical, but if I give a strange example, it's not strange, but an example from a colleague of his or someone who furthered his work after his death is Walter Johannes Stein. And he was very active in trying to understand the resources of the world as such, not the resources of the world as owned by Germany or France or England or anywhere else, but taking a whole inventory. It's now known as the World Energy Congress, I think, and it celebrated its 100th anniversary on the 11th of July, actually, this year, 2024. It was created by a man called Daniel Dunlop, who is an industrialist from the West, but a close colleague of Rudolf Steiner in a certain way. And already then, in 1924, he created a conference of 3,000 people, chaired by the then Prince of Wales, namely the future King of England, to look at how the resources of the world belong to the whole of humanity, not to a particular nation. And so Walter Johannes Stein was very involved in this. And one thing he described, for example, which is, you could say it's kind of cyclical, but not from the intellect, from the world. I think he had a period like every 7 or 8 years, something like this. In farming, you can expect a drought. So you can, it's a kind of, it's not a cycle, it's not every 8 years. It's like the same thing I would say as a sailor. Beware the 8th or 9th wave. It's going to be bigger than all the rest. I can't say whether it's the 8th or the 9th, but you will know after a certain number of waves, there'll be one which is, it's called the rogue wave. It's not got the behavior of all the others. And if you're not aware of this, it can capsize you. So you just keep your eyes skinned for the rogue wave, right? And he says, Stein says, similarly, you will find in agriculture, over a period of 7, 8, 9 years, there will be a drought. So what do we do with this? We can, this is me speaking, we can do the Ethiopian story in 1980 and deny those people their resources. So when there's a drought hit, they're dead meat. They're all going to starve to death unless the UN comes and, takes the wheat out of the sea and dries it all out again, because it's being dumped in the sea rather than distributed. So we keep the price up in Chicago. So the UN comes along, lifts it out of the sea, dries it all out, desalinates it, and gives it to the people of Ethiopia so they don't starve to death. We can treat our resources in this way, because it's kind of what's going on. Or we can say, we know there's going to be a drought every 7 or 8 years or something like this. This is life. And we can accommodate that in our pricing, not by dumping wheat to keep the price up, but by harvesting wheat and storing it. And just knowing this, we can manage this. This is the distributional problem we have. And Keynes would also say, very clearly in 1930, there is no economic problem. We do not have the problem of insufficient resources for humanity. The problem we have is an inability to distribute our resources equitably. He's very clear about this, and you can't blame that on economics. You can blame that on greed and all sorts of things, but as far as the economy is concerned, there's nothing we have to do. The resources that we need are adequate to what we need. This is really important. So don't blame the economy or the economists for the fact we don't know how to share, or that maybe some corporations are rather more interested in its share value, if it's in the, in the future markets in wheat, than whether people eat or not. Because when you get into it, it's really on that, gets down to that kind of thing, And so if you're Ethiopian and you're starving to death, you should have thought about that before you were born, frankly. And that you can hear off the radar down the corridors over coffee, right? Even though we don't believe in reincarnation, we nevertheless can say it's your fault for being born Ethiopian. You should have been born in some nice cold, northern country, and in the upper classes of that country, what's more. Otherwise, it's just survival of the fittest, and it's your problem. So don't underestimate the degree to which this kind of thinking is actually active in the minds of many people in finance. Scratch them off the record without the phone, without the recording, and they will say this, or they're required to see your interview before it ever gets published, in case they've let this little fall out of the bag in some way. So I'm saying that to kind of, so those people know that I'm naming them, or that whatever's behind that knows I'm naming it. I'm not annoyed about it, but I'm totally unaware about it. And everything I say is mindful, partly to tell it to go away, partly not to upset it. Because you don't contest self-centeredness. It's not an easy thing to do. If I think more in terms of a magic flute, you have to kind of increase the light in the room and the darkness will shrink. You don't talk about the darkness. You don't say, please, can you get less? You just, the effect you're having, but you don't look at it. It's like you don't look at the snake, or it'll catch you in its own story. You just have to know it's there, and you just move on. So this is a strange thing to say, but I'm quite sure in our soul alchemy and the way we understand things, we need to have a certain sense that in life there are these rhythms and so on. They may be super inconvenient to our rational mind or our self-centered mind, which wants to eat all the bread that's available today and not even stock it, right? Even in our self-centeredness, we're not very good at managing our resources, and that builds up into very short-term increased profit margins, not profit margins, but return to profit. Every quarter day, I want to see whether you've made more money, and that drives companies into super aggressive financial strategies and so on, which in the end are self-defeating. So so it's pretty ingrained, and we have to find a way out of this. And so what Steiner is saying is at that point, you have to be clear, one has to be clear that humanity was struggling epistemologically to understand what is this world which is now banned from its consciousness, but wants to let back in again, but can't admit to doing this. And I think it's a hugely subtle problem. It's not easily resolved by just telling them, which is a little bit the critique of Steiner. It's no good you telling me what world conception I'm supposed to have. I have to find it myself out of my innocence, out of my own pain, or whatever, if I'm to understand you. If we can get to that point, then everything that we call factors of production, they just, so to speak, automatically, not automatically, we would never call them that in the first place. We would call them, I'm talking about land, labor, and capital, we would never conceive of them as commodities. We would never treat them as commodities. There would be no market in land, labor, and capital. Just try saying that in the City of London and see if you get invited back into the room, right? There's no market in finance. What? There's no market in labor and there's no market in land. Now what am I going to do? I can manage if you say there's no market in one of them or maybe two. But if you say there's no market in all three, I have no ground beneath me. So you might as well leave the room. We're just not going to go there. Simple as that. Because our whole, especially the City of London, what are we based on? At least that there's a market in finance that we control. So if you tell me there isn't one, I agree with you at my peril. And a lot hangs on this. So one shouldn't underestimate what people subconsciously have to balance when they meet what I call associative economics in professional contexts. They very quickly sense where this is going, and their interest is where might it lead to once it's gone through this kind of closure point. Their interest really is what happens after this. And I'm saying this at some length because that is where Steiner comes relevant. It doesn't matter he died 100 years ago or that he was Austrian. All this doesn't really matter. What matters is at this point, you start to understand, he's putting names to the things which we dare not name. But then you have to deal with the problem that he's what he calls capital, or rather what I'm calling capital, he calls Geist. So we've had this discussion. How do you get from Geist to capital? And since we've dealt with land and labor, I want to go straight to that. You have to do this other thing. So Geist is pointing to something which capital has also to point to. And if they're not pointing to the same thing, there's a problem in the translation. It's not going to be done by dictionary.